The math of modern survival no longer adds up, and it has nothing to do with personal failure. Right now, millions of Americans are waking up, driving to work, fulfilling every societal obligation, and still watching their bank accounts bleed out by the third week of the month. They did not lose their jobs. They did not buy a house they could not afford. They did not max out credit cards on luxury vacations. They are doing everything right, yet they are falling behind. The terrifying reality of the current economic moment is that the margin for ordinary life has completely vanished, swallowed whole by a silent, interconnected network of rising costs that defies traditional economic logic. You are told inflation is cooling. You are shown charts indicating a stabilizing economy. But when you stand at the checkout counter, the numbers on the screen tell a radically different story. This is not a psychological illusion, and it is not a temporary glitch. It is the result of a single, massive structural shift that most people in this country have never even heard of. A geopolitical and geographic trap that is simultaneously squeezing the price of the fuel in your tank, the food on your table, and the electricity keeping your home livable. When every essential expense surges at the exact same time, there is no good month to catch up. There is no easy adjustment left to make. You cannot budget your way out of a systemic trap. To understand how your local grocery bill is being dictated by events half a world away, you have to look at a body of water most Americans will never see in their lifetimes. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow strategic choke point wedged between the Persian Gulf and the open ocean. On a standard world map, it looks like a geographic footnote, a tiny blue corridor separating Iran from the Arabian Peninsula. But this footnote dictates the velocity of the global economy. Before the recent escalations and military conflicts severely choked traffic through the corridor, earlier this year, roughly 1/5 of the entire world's petroleum supply flowed through this single point every single day. When the shipping lanes began to freeze due to asymmetric warfare and drone threats, the energy markets did not wait for a formal crisis declaration. Brent crude skyrocketed to $138 a barrel on April 7th, maintaining a brutal average of $117 throughout the entire month. For the average consumer, these are abstract figures traded by algorithms in Manhattan or London. In the real world, those numbers are an immediate economic death sentence for affordability. There is a widespread, deeply flawed assumption permeating American discourse. The idea that because the United States has achieved record-breaking domestic oil production, we are somehow insulated from the chaos of the Persian Gulf. It sounds logical, but it completely ignores how global commodities operate. American refineries do not exist in a vacuum. They operate within a highly integrated global pricing mechanism. A gallon of diesel refined in Texas competes directly with a gallon of diesel needed in Europe or Asia. When the cost of ensuring an ocean-going supertanker quadruples overnight, or when shipping fleets are forced to reroute thousands of miles around the Cape of Good Hope, the global supply chain absorbs the shock, and the price of energy surges everywhere instantly. The geographic distance between a missile strike in the Middle East and a diesel pump at a truck stop in Ohio is 7,000 miles, but economically, they are connected by a wire. The cost always finds its way to the bottom line of ordinary households. The federal government attempts to blunt the blade by issuing summer fuel waivers, adjusting blending regulations to inject slight flexibility into the domestic gasoline market. It helps at the absolute margins, but a regulatory band-aid cannot dredge a blocked waterway, nor can it magically replace millions of barrels of disrupted transit. The true threat facing the American consumer over the upcoming months is not a sudden dramatic shortage where gas stations physically run dry. The threat is an unbearable volatility that makes long-term planning impossible for businesses and families alike. When a logistics company or a regional distributor cannot predict what its fleet operations will cost next month, they do not wait around to absorb the loss. They preemptively raise prices across the board just to survive the coming shock. This baseline fear ripples out from the transportation sectors and embeds itself into the very soil of the country, transforming a distant maritime conflict into an immediate domestic crisis. The price hike you see today is just the first wave of a structural tide that is completely shifting the reality of what it costs to live in America. The agricultural engine of the United States operates not as a pastoral tradition, but as a hyper-calibrated heavy industrial supply chain. When energy markets experience sustained shock, the impact registers immediately in the production economics of the American food supply. Modern agricultural production relies on continuous inputs of diesel fuel, synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, electricity, and intensive mechanical logistics. Data collected from agricultural sectors across the Midwest confirms a compounding structural squeeze. A comprehensive industry survey encompassing more than 5,700 commercial agricultural operators revealed that approximately 70% of farmers reported an inability to purchase their baseline requirements of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium fertilizers for the current planting cycle. This deficit is directly correlated with cost escalation. By the conclusion of the spring planting window, the average retail price of farm-grade diesel fuel had registered a 46% increase compared to baseline metrics monitored in late February. Concurrently, 58% of surveyed producers reported a measurable deterioration in their net farm income relative to the previous fiscal year. The mechanics of this agricultural contraction operate on a delayed timeline, meaning the financial strain borne by primary producers does not instantly register on retail supermarket shelves. Agricultural operations adapt to capital constraints through specific, reductive management decisions. To mitigate unprecedented input costs, operators systematically decrease fertilizer application densities, leave marginal acreage unplanted, substitute optimal crop varieties for less resource-intensive alternatives, and defer essential capital expenditures on machinery maintenance. While these measures preserve short-term liquidity for individual farming operations, they introduce systemic vulnerabilities into the broader food infrastructure. Reduced fertilizer application directly correlates with a lower metric tonnage of crop yield per acre. The reduction of active acreage restricts aggregate domestic supply. Deferring mechanical maintenance raises the statistical probability of equipment failure during high-stress operational windows such as harvest cycles, while the accumulation of short-term operating debt leaves agricultural enterprises exposed to sudden fluctuations in global commodity markets. A quantifiable manifestation of this structural vulnerability is visible in the domestic grain sector. In the Central Plains region, specifically across the winter wheat belt of Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, the convergence of elevated production costs and adverse meteorological conditions has altered output projections. Production reports issued for the current harvest cycle indicate that total domestic winter wheat yield is projected at approximately 1.05 billion bushels. This represents a 25% decline in aggregate volume when measured against the total yield recorded during the preceding harvest year. The macroeconomic implications of a 25% reduction in a foundational commodity extend far beyond the direct production of consumer flour. Wheat products function as critical baseline inputs across a highly integrated manufacturing matrix, serving as primary components in commercial baking, processed food stabilizers, industrial thickeners, and livestock feed formulations for the domestic beef and poultry sectors. The transition of an agricultural supply shock from a primary production deficit to a retail consumer price increase follows a strict institutional path. When harvest yields contract, primary grain elevators and processors utilize existing long-term supply contracts and draw down strategic grain reserves to maintain operational continuity. As these physical reserves deplete, processing conglomerates adjust their procurement rates, forcing secondary food manufacturers to renegotiate wholesale purchasing contracts. These elevated wholesale costs subsequently move through regional distribution networks, ultimately forcing retail corporations to adjust their pricing structures across multiple consumer categories simultaneously. Because this logistical transmission requires months to execute, the current retail price environment reflects supply decisions made nearly half a year prior. The stability observed on contemporary retail shelves masks a backlog of accumulated systemic costs currently moving through the midstream supply chain, creating a structural momentum that cannot be quickly reversed by short-term macroeconomic policy adjustments. The secondary phase of the contemporary supply chain crisis manifests within a highly specialized, technical sector of the petrochemical industry, the production and distribution of Group 3 base oils. These highly refined, hydrocracked petroleum derivatives serve as the critical foundational component for modern high-performance lubricants, which are legally and mechanically mandated for use in commercial freight fleets, heavy agricultural machinery, electrical generation equipment, and industrial manufacturing systems. According to industrial manufacturing data, domestic consumption of Group 3 base oils relies heavily on international maritime trade, with approximately 44% of the aggregate United States supply originating directly from specialized refining complexes located within the Persian Gulf region. The abrupt reduction in transit volumes through primary maritime choke points has severed these established supply lines, precipitating a structural deficit that cannot be rapidly mitigated by domestic oil extraction activities. This imbalance highlights a fundamental structural paradox within the domestic energy sector. While federal agencies frequently report record-breaking volumes of domestic crude oil extraction, the physical reality of chemical refining imposes rigid operational limits. Raw, unrefined domestic petroleum cannot be directly substituted for finished industrial lubricants. The chemical transformation requires advanced hydrocracking facilities capable of operating under extreme pressure and temperature variables to remove impurities and alter molecular structures. The construction and regulatory certification of domestic refining infrastructure capable of expanding Group 3 base oil production requires a capital investment cycle extending between 3 and 5 years. Consequently, the immediate deficit has triggered an acute supply contraction throughout regional industrial distribution networks, leading to a systematic depletion of commercial inventories. The operational consequences of this chemical deficit are concentrated heavily within the domestic logistics and surface transportation sectors, which function as the structural baseline for interstate commerce. Data compiled from commercial fleet management registries indicates that independent trucking operations and corporate freight carriers are experiencing unprecedented escalations in maintenance and operating costs. The scarcity of specialized synthetic engine lubricants has resulted in wholesale price increases tracking between 30 and 50% across primary distribution channels. Furthermore, fleet managers report extended procurement delays, with the lead time for standard commercial maintenance inputs increasing from a historical baseline of 48 hours to global averages exceeding 14 business days. These delays directly restrict fleet availability, reduce operational efficiency, and force logistics corporations to run assets past standard service intervals, thereby increasing the statistical probability of catastrophic mechanical failure during transit. This operational strain is further complicated by an institutional conflict between federal regulatory frameworks and the immediate material realities of the transportation sector. The Environmental Protection Agency maintains rigid compliance mandates regarding exhaust emissions for commercial vehicles, which strictly require the utilization of high-performance synthetic lubricants to prevent the degradation of advanced emissions control systems, such as diesel particulate filters and selective catalytic reduction units. The usage of non-compliant, lower-grade alternative lubricants to circumvent the current shortage results in immediate regulatory non-compliance, substantial financial penalties, and the voiding of manufacturer equipment warranties. Fleet operators are consequently trapped within an unyielding regulatory matrix. They must either absorb unprecedented cost premiums to procure compliant lubricants, let essential transport assets sit idle in maintenance bays, or operate in violation of federal environmental standards. The financial data released by National Logistics Associations confirms that this operational gridlock has pushed the small enterprise sector of the trucking industry toward widespread insolve. NC. Independent owner-operators, who control over 80% of the active freight capacity in the United States, operate on exceptionally narrow financial margins. When the cost of primary fuel inputs is compounded by escalating maintenance costs and extended equipment downtime, the net cost per mile of operation outpaces negotiated freight rates. Corporate transport data reveals a sharp contraction in spot market freight availability, alongside a measured increase in small fleet bankruptcies during the preceding 2 quarters. Because the transportation sector functions as the transmission mechanism for all physical goods, these systemic overhead increases are directly transferred to secondary industries, ensuring that the structural costs incurred in the maintenance bay are inevitably reflected in the final retail pricing of all consumer commodities.